Hello, YouTube. Let's talk about, well, the murder hobo problem that people identify with griefing, and the main reason why this happens isn't because these players are bored. Unlike some people who will mention in the comment section, well, they only do this because they're bored. No, trust me, I know some of these people from previous games. They do this because this is what they're going to do. Even Besieger, aka Commander Harry Potter, stated after he lost all of his modules that he's currently regrinding to gain, that the reason why he would still be here is because of the salt. And the reason why they're able to collect salt is things are completely imbalanced in terms of consequences versus the outcome of actions here. And what I'm specifically talking about is, let's say the rebuy cost on an FDL is about 2 million credits. I'm kind of throwing out some general numbers here. It's pretty easy to grind 2 million credits in Haz-Res bounty hunting in an hour. But let's say they kill a player cutter with a, let's just say, 20 million credit rebuy. Well, it's going to take that person 10 hours in a cutter at 2 million an hour to regrind up the credits for that cutter. Now, of course, with things like Quints and other broken game mechanics, as you could say, that pay out like, broken slot machines, it's a little bit lesser of an issue. But nonetheless, they take a look at this equation and be like, well, I can engage in this behavior, and even if I get killed occasionally, it's an hour worth of my time versus I just cost that person 10 hours worth of grinding to recover what they lost. And because that equation is so imbalanced at this point in time, there isn't really any consequence for not engaging in that behavior. Eventually, what's going to happen, I think, to curtail this behavior is essentially insurance has to go away for those repeatedly engaging in this. And at that point, when they do lose that FDL, they also lose, they have to rebuy the ship, all of the modules, re-engineer all the modules, and that's going to be a lot more painful in terms of time, essentially, in order to recover what was lost. It's only until the consequence of basically when they do suffer a loss that they have to spend an equal amount of time or more time than what they're inflicting upon the other person before they're going to stop engaging in this behavior. Of course, at that point, they'll claim they came, they saw, they conquered the game, you all are a bunch of plebes and noobs, and now we're on to greener, better pastures, basically places where they can go on to the next game, and that's usually in an infant state at that point. Get in early, build up their ships or their character stats or whatever it happens to be in that game, so that they have an advantage over people who will come to that game later on in the development cycle. And that's essentially this modus operandi of these people. Now, traditionally, I've been on the side of these people are toxic cancer and must be removed, and I'll be on the side of the chemotherapy that removes them. However, a game has to be set up and designed in such a way that the community can eventually come together, develop essentially a set of unwritten community rules, for lack of a better term, that then the player base more or less adheres to and accepts. The clearest example I've ever seen of this was in a browser-based game that I played off and on for close to a decade, if not over a decade, called Star Kingdoms, in which about a year into the game, a bunch of the top players at the time and leaders of guilds or alliances in that game's parlance came together and developed the unwritten rules of the game of what was a fair hit, what was a fair retail, and all of these things that basically served as the diplomatic backbone of the game, probably to this day if it is still around. At least the last time that I played around in 2012, 2013, those rules were still very much in place over a decade later, and that was developed by the player community. Now, in that game, the game universe reset every 2 to 3 months in rounds, and also each round featured permadeath. And if you pissed off enough people, or the wrong people, basically your kingdom would be taken out, and that would be it for that round. Problem solved. So there was a mechanism in there for the community to police itself. The other game that saw this happen in was Battlestar Galactica Online, ironically with some of these same people, in which there came a point where we figured out collectively on our side we could basically starve the other side of resources, and then went through essentially an argent war of attrition. And there was more of us than there were of them, eventually we would come out on top, and that is essentially what happened within that game. Now, again, there wasn't exactly the ability to attack any player at any time, but there was no solo or private group mode in which to hide in. And the reason why I haven't spearheaded any type of efforts in this game in particular, one being kind of tired of doing so, especially against the same familiar names and faces, is the fact that very early on I came to realize that with solo and private group modes carrying over into open, there's virtually impossible to do so. There's no way that we could prevent players from gaining resources over time, which in this game, essentially all you really need is credits, from being able to quickly recoup losses and just be right back at it over and over again. So until ship insurance is essentially removed from these people from engaging in these actions, and the cost, kind of the weight of balance there is, well, if I lose 2 million credits in an hour worth of game time. If I inflict a loss on you, you lose 5 hours of game time or 10 hours of game time, whatever that may be. They're going to continue to engage in this type of behavior because, again, they can elicit a response and a reaction from players and from people playing the game, especially those who are losing their ships. So, again, but by the very nature of Elite Dangerous's design with this, with the 3 game modes being interchangeable, there's very little that can be done to combat this, at least on the player side of things. You can absolutely, or Frontier can absolutely do something by boosting the consequences. Now, they're going to start doing that in 2.4. Sandro Sammarco has said that, this is kind of the first step with the introduction of the elimination of the Sidewinder loophole, or the Suicide Winder loophole, and that things could be the screws could be tightened down with them losing insurance eventually on their ships. Again, I think the first steps are going to be the introduction of the new bounty system, and as well as the removing of the Suicide Winder loophole, but still most of these players, a couple million credits, a few 100,000 credits for the rebuy and like a Vulture or a Courier or something like that isn't going to serve as much of a deterrent. Starting to lock players out of systems because of security status and their notoriety, I think that that'll be a start, locking them out of places like Jameson Memorial, so if they do want to go and up their gear and stuff like that, they're going to have to go to other systems. I think placing their ships that are in lawful systems on lockdown to where if they commit a crime or enough crimes and say they're FDL and they want to transfer to their FAS or to their taxi cab ship to go to the next zone and call in their ship, well, maybe those ships are on lockdown and they can't be transferred. The other option there is, of course, they start losing their insurance to the point where they have to do a full rebuy if they lose their ship, including all engineered modules. Eventually what this will lead to is they're going to find themselves more often than not at a disadvantage over other players who have engaged in more lawful behavior. And again, at this point where they no longer have the superior edge in the fight, and they more or less have to engage people on equal or lesser terms, they're going to essentially remove themselves from the game because they don't like to lose. And again, that's just kind of their mentality and how to engage with it. So I'm sorry this video's run a little bit longer, but this is something that is going to need to be addressed in beyond 2.4. I think they're going to get a start with it. We're going to see how well things will pan out, but I guarantee you that you're going to have to ramp it up to a notch where even if they're flying an FDL, the punishments are such that if they're going out and engaging on this in a regular behavioral pattern, that when they lose, it's going to cost them 10 to 20 hours of gameplay, just as it would for that player in the cutter or the Corvette or whatever ship that was lost would take them to recover at that level. And until that becomes more or less equal or even disproportionate on the side of the aggressor, the problem of the murder hobos or griefing or whatever you want to call it is going to continue until basically the cost becomes prohibitive for the aggressive side. Anyway, that's kind of my thoughts on murder hobos and whatnot. And be sure to let me know what you think in the comment section down below. Again, this video ran a little bit long. Try to keep them shorter in the future. Until next time, see you later.